brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead. I have two options for you guys. We're doing ancient Greek still. We can continue what we were doing last time. We're going to go over organization of military warfare, finish up with state and organization, stuff like that. Or we can talk about daily life. What are people more excited about? Any feedback? You guys wanted?
Yeah, I know lots about military. And the daily life sounds interesting, actually.
Then we're going to go with the daily life, and I don't have any notes for this one, so I'm going to have to go from memory. And this is probably stuff that most of you guys maybe heard little bits and pieces of, but a lot of it is not generally well known. So how was daily life organized, and particularly how did the persons, from the moment that a person came into this world, how did they progress throughout time, throughout their childhood, early adulthood, and then adulthood? Well, as I mentioned before, for the first 7, and this was uniform for almost every city-state, with some exceptions like Sparta, because Sparta is generally just a very special place, as we all know. But even Sparta, to a point, followed this sort of pattern. So until you were 7-year-old, a little person was considered to be the mother's responsibility. They lived on the mother's half of the house, and was, as we remember, in ancient Greece, the female and the male parts of the house were divided, and they were separate, and all the gatherings, all the important affairs took place on the male part, and the Gyneceum, which was the female part, was where the women congregated if the neighbors came to visit. Women were fairly cloistered. They rarely left their immediate vicinity of their house or their yards, depending on yards by our modern standards. But they typically really did not even go to the market. They didn't do any shopping. They did not participate in public life very much. And if they did, they were usually accompanied by a servant, a slave servant, or a husband. So Victorian times very much kind of revisited that idea. But at least Victorian women could go shopping and spend their husband's money, while Greek women generally just sat at home and watched over the children. So the child was, till 7 years old, the child was with his or her mother. And I say in this case, his or her, because up until the age of 7, the boys and the girls and the kids of different classes all played together. There was not any technical education applied to the child at that time, other than just the general upbringing. And at that point in time, not education exactly, but the term upbringing, or rather shaping of the child, was taking place. The child was learning, just like any kid, learning language, kind of mimicking the adults. The kids would be allowed to run out in the street, boys and girls of all classes, slaves and adults. Slaves and, citizens of different classes. They would play games like King of the Hill was one of the very popular games. They played various ball games. There was no sports in ancient Greece that involved the use of a ball, but they did have balls made out of leather, stuffed with either grass or with wool. Then there were a lot of children's games that are very similar to our games today. Little kids, especially in the crib, had kind of hanky toys. They also had dolls and other toys that had moving parts. So these, they would have toy figures that would have joints that you would be able to move, very much like today's Barbie, I guess, in a way. I guess Barbie is less mobile than some other similar toys, but anyway. So they were fairly advanced. I mean, childhood was definitely, in ancient Greece, unlike in a lot of other ancient cultures, childhood was definitely distinguished as a special time period when a person was not yet a member of society, when they were treated with special care and special regard. These kids were not very terribly restricted. They were allowed to just have fun, spend a lot of free time, just being kids and enjoying themselves and just hanging out. There was no centralized child care because every house, even low middle class house, would typically have either wet nurse or some slaves slave mommies and daddies who would be watching over the kid, specific slaves who were there to be as nurses, to be as kind of caretakers for the children, and of course the women themselves oftentimes would come out and watch their children play, but generally it was something that the slaves oversaw. And we're talking about, by the way, about the time period from about 600 BC to 400 AD. So that's quite a long time period. And of course, there were some variations throughout this time period, but the system as a whole kind of persisted throughout that time period. And moreover, as we talk more about it, you will see that it persisted pretty much to today in a lot of places in this world. When later on in Greece, when such thing as a slave Greek became a possibility, because in early Greece, you could not have a slave Greek, that was just unthinkable. But later on in Greece, various wars, various occurrences took place. And so there was such thing as a slave Greeks. And so particularly coveted, particularly respected kind of a nanny would be a Spartan woman. They were considered to be excellent wet nurses because they would pass on to the children because in Sparta, unlike the rest of Greece, the women, as we've mentioned before, had quite a bit of freedom. They also were very athletic, and they were considered to be generally fairly tough, fair, sparse, and not likely to terribly spoil the child, and at the same time, not likely to abuse the child. Greeks believed that a child should not be, coddled, but they also believed that a child should not be, beaten or terrified to the point where you would break the future citizen inside this little person. They believed that kids should be brought up in, modest, moderate, kind of somewhat strict but loving environments. Kids were very precious, and especially legitimate citizen kids were very precious, of course, in the Greek society. So that's why the Spartan women were in such high demand. They were considered to be excellent athletic examples. They were considered to be very strict but loving and very well. And also Spartan women were typically very well educated. And oftentimes the very first lessons that a child would take in the child's life would be from his wet nurse or his nanny. Well, when the child turned 7, every Greek child, every free Greek child, I should say, of male, of course, gender, male sex, because girls were not highly educated. We might have some time to talk about education among the girls, but that was a very special class. Most girls at that point in time, their education never started. They spent most of their life on the female part of the house until they got married off. The boys got sent to school. The level of literacy in ancient Greece was unprecedented for the ancient world at those times, especially early on, partially it's because the Greeks lucked out, in the sense that they encountered the Phoenician alphabet early on. We've talked about ancient Phoenician peoples, and because that, if you are, for example, trying to write cuneiform, or you're trying to figure out hieroglyphs, it's quite a complex art. You're going to have to, it's quite an undertaking to learn those systems of writing, and it will take you a very long time. So very few privileged people, privileged in the sense of not even necessarily financial sense, but in the sense of being select and afforded an education, would be able to master those very complex, very mysterious, very convoluted disciplines. The Greeks, dealing with the alphabet, learning basically how to write and read was fairly simple, just based on just their writing system. So it was normal for a Greek to be at least minimally educated. Every Greek could write, every Greek could read, every Greek could count, every male Greek, every male Greek, of course. So at 7 years old, your little boys are getting set. Oh, there's Nathan. So at 7 years old, even though at some point in time it was argued that 6 would be better, but 7 was generally about the age, the child would be sent off to special school. Now, we know the word, I'm going to try to pronounce it in English, pedagogy. Is that how you pronounce it? Pedagogos, oftentimes, at least in Russian language, nowadays means a teacher, an instructor. But in ancient Greece, it was a special slave that was attached to every little child about that age, who would walk the child to school and from school, who would make sure the child attended classes, who would help the child with the child's assignments. In other words, it was not a teacher, but it was a babysitter. but those slaves were oftentimes treated as part of the family. They were respected because they were entrusted with a very, very important task of keeping the children safe and keeping them on track and keeping them out of trouble. They were basically personal kind of tutors, bodyguards, babysitters of the really little kids. And as I've mentioned in the last podcast, so in this initial stage, you would have private schools. The only way in Greece that you could have a public education, there was two cases. And one was a very, very rare occurrence. If you were an orphan and your parents or your father died defending your polis, then the state would take, and you had no other relatives. That was important because in ancient times, of course, most families had, they had uncles, aunts, thrice removed cousins, whatever. And so oftentimes, even when the parents would be gone, somebody within the family would always take the child in. But in those very few instances when a child was truly an orphan and the child parent has died in defending the city-state, then the state would take on complete responsibility for the well-being, upbringing, and the financial needs of that child. But generally, these little schools, they were private, and they were not very expensive, because there was 3 stages of education in Greek schools. So the initial, basically, we'll call it elementary school as a comparison, was for very, very little kids, 7 to, let's say, roughly about 11 to 14. They didn't really have like a limited time of education. It was basically you learned and you stayed in that grade until you figured out what you needed to learn before you could move on to the next stage. So there was not a set time. It wasn't like grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, but generally most kids went through it between the ages of 7 and 11 or so, sometimes 7 and 14. And so what did they learn in this initial little school? And these schools were usually run by a single teacher, and it was a very basic level teacher. It would be a private institution, not very expensive. These teachers were not considered to be very prestigious people because anybody in Greece could become a teacher. If, there is an example, for example, of a tyrant. I think Dionysius, I think was his name. Who he was a tyrant of a city. There was a coup, then a counter coup, then another coup. Bottom line is he got thrown out of his seat as a tyrant, and so he ran away to a different city-state and quietly sat in a corner being a teacher. So to be a teacher was considered to be, because he was really afraid of being hunted down and killed. So that was his way of saying, look, I'm harmless, I'm poor, I'm pathetic, don't mess with me, I'm sweet, peaceful person, I'm just teaching little kids here. So if you wanted to open up a school, what you would do, you would either rent a space, so you had your own space, a classroom, and you would invite students. And if you were a good teacher, then parents would, by the word of mouth, would tell each other that you're a good teacher. They would send more kids to you. So the classroom size could really vary, vary from maybe 1-2 students to up to probably no more than 30. And children of all ages within that initial school, they would be taught at the same time by one teacher within the same classroom. And the way that it was organized, the teacher usually sat in a chair and the kids sat on the floor. And so the education in ancient Greece in general was broken up in 2 halves of it. The first half of it was the physical education. That was gymnastics, what we call today gymnastics. And it was and that word, that concept comes from the idea that Greeks practiced their sports and all of their different exercises in the nude. The other part had to do with the muses, and it was more the intellectual. So there's the physical part, which consisted of a lot of just vigorous exercise, fighting, running, jumping, tumbling. Rough housing, for example, oftentimes was highly encouraged in Greek schools. Bullying was also highly encouraged because they believed, especially in Sparta, more so than anywhere else, but that was true about other different cities as well, because they believed that a kid should know how to handle bullies. Kids should form coalitions. They should come up with some sort of ideas. It toughens the kids up. So bullying, running down after school, beating up, that kind of stuff, as long as it wasn't murder, was more or less encouraged. I mean, parents would not interfere in that sort of situation. And mothers, by the way, were not allowed to have anything to do with their kids other than, pet them on the head, really, once they turned 7, if it was a boy, because at that point in time, the father took over the rearing of the child. I'm going to stop for a second, see if anybody has any questions, comments, or thoughts.
I do have a little bit of a question. I
Mhm.
think I might have brought it up in the last one, but it has to do with hold on, let me start video now that I have a shirt that fits.
Well, that's nice. Having a shirt always helps. I have a shirt that fits out. It almost didn't
Oh,
today.
the other one was too tight and it's hot here. But it's about the whole ideology of Plato, because that was a big deal at the time. And I wonder, how much that actually has trickled down, because I can't remember exactly what method, what system he had come up with, but it seemed like it went kind of into that ideology. But it was like you take your children and then you put them into a government system, and then they're basically raised by the government. I probably already brought this up, but I'm curious how that really fits into what we're talking about now.
It doesn't. It actually doesn't. And I'm not sure.
In Sparta.
First of all, well, Sparta, it wasn't government. It was the military structure.
Right.
But so the way that it worked, so the city, we've talked about how demos is the people in Greece, right? That's where the word democracy comes from. Well, the demos, the peoples lived in demi, and in these little, basically like neighborhood. Wow, how would I put them? Districts, but they were smaller than districts, bigger than neighborhoods. And so, for example, in Athens, for majority of its existence, there was 100 of those. So a lot of local matters were solved locally. There was like a communal council within that neighborhood. And so a lot of not state affairs, but like, neighborhood stuff, like whose dog pooped on my lawn, and whose more ran over my sprinkler head, that sort of thing. Sorry, I'm the head of the HOA committee on sprinklers now, so that's a very hot subject for me, sprinkler heads and mowers. But anyway, so those things would be decided within those groups. And so the children oftentimes, because they would play in the yard, right, they would play right outside of the houses within that same neighborhood. Generally, little kids don't venture terribly far away from their household. All the neighbors would watch each other's kids grow up. And so these children would be very much exposed to the local community, but not necessarily to the governing body of the polis, because you had to pass through certain stages before you were considered to be competent and trustworthy and mature enough, frankly, to be even discussing those matters with adults. I mean, yeah, I will get to a little bit later in stage 2 of education. They did talk about it a lot, but as far as being actually a part of it, no. Up until you reach the age of 20, sometimes more, Greeks allowed their young to age, especially boys, to grow up pretty late. You were not considered a fully functional male until you were about 30 years old, plus or minus.
Well, that was actually my other question, because I was curious about the education system that they actually had, because it does seem like we do mimic the Greeks a lot. And, so it's logical to ask, I figure.
Yeah, no, and that's where we get our preschool, which the Greeks didn't have, but we get, especially elementary, middle school, and then your high school. I mean, that's kind of the same idea. But Greeks had a slightly different breakdown. So the kids are studying, they're studying 2 things. So they're starting to learn grammar. They're starting to learn reading and writing, basic rudimentary skills. And at the same time, they're doing a lot of vigorous exercise. The intellectual part of this education included in it music and singing and dancing. It was very important. That's, music, those kind of related words. They learned, of course, reading and writing, literature, and they learned public speaking, all those kinds of discipline, and of course how to count. Every Greek had to be able to add, subtract, do basic calculations at that stage. This first stage was really mandatory for anybody who in any way, shape, or form consider themselves to be a worthy person. So even the most poor family would scrape up a little bit of money and send their kid to at least the least prestigious of these schools. And these teachers, like I said, they were private, but the teacher who taught the physical course, especially in the second stage of education, which we're about to get to, was oftentimes actually selected and nominated by the polis committee, because they considered the physical education very, very important. And that's because later on that was going to lead into a military service, and they wanted their boys to be in mint shape and best physical condition to be able to defend their home polis. Like we talked about last time, the story of the, when Sparta attacked Athens, and the whole draft of the 19-year-old boys for that year who happened to be at the border when Spartan troops came attacking, while the city, behind them was gathering up resources and getting ready to defend itself, all the boys died, every single one of the boys who were born that year. So it was very, very, very important to make sure that your males are in perfect prime physical condition all the time, because they were warriors by default. Every citizen was a warrior. Every citizen had a duty and an eagerness to defend, as I've mentioned before, their home. So, so these were basically kind of skills. And another problem was, for example, learning how to do, basically basic arithmetic in ancient Greece was because they didn't have letters as such. Like a lot of cultures, they used, they didn't have numbers as such. They used letters to stand in place of numbers. And so it was a fairly complex system. While writing up like a year, 1934 wasn't so hard because you knew which letter corresponded to which numeric value. But then once you had to start doing calculations, that got fairly convoluted. It was the reason why mathematics jumped so far ahead was once the Arabic numerals got introduced to the world as a whole, is partially because they were very convenient to use in very complex calculations. So in order to be able to count in that old, like for example, in Old Russian, again, and a lot of other languages, the same thing, letters and numbers were used, the same symbols were used for letters and numbers. It was a very complex system of how you showed decimals and all that other stuff. So the kids had to learn at least the basic add up, add plus, minus, divide, multiply, hated algebra, but I loved multiply, right? Sort of from a rap song. So at that point in time, once the kids managed to get through that basic first course at whatever, if they were like particularly slow, they could have been in that first stage until they turned 25. You stayed there for as long as your parents were willing to pay and for as long as you needed to stay there to learn. And the teacher would be the one who would inform your parents, and of course your pedagogos would inform your parents of your progress. Now, if you were some peasant working on the field, that was up to here of education for your child, right? You would call your kids probably out of school at that point in time because you need a helping hand out on your fields. But if you were anything middle class enough, then you send your kids to the second stage. And the second stage was the same things. It still had the physical education. It still had the writing, the reading, and the speech, the mathematics, but it was far more in depth. At this point in time, they would do things like, of course, very vigorous, and they would start doing some prep work for combat, like exercising the swords and other weapons, not just general physical development, but literally like, working with weapons, preparing for military service, not directly, but indirectly. But they would do things like, for example, some of the historical, like some of the texts that were oftentimes used. Homer, of course, was number one go-to text throughout Greek history. So they might read a passage with a passage from. Oh, I didn't tell you one interesting thing. So how did they teach the children how to read and write? So the way they would do it is at first that the teacher would sit there basically with a book and name just the symbols and what. Make the children, like they do today, copy the symbols, right? And they would just memorize. A is written this way, B is written this way, so on and so forth. Then they would start writing little syllables. And what did they write on? Papyrus was very expensive in ancient Greece. So they would use these wooden tablets, like wooden kind of boards that would have beeswax on it. And they would have sharpened sticks that they could write their stuff on. But then when your lesson is over, you can erase it because beeswax is soft. And it was much cheaper and much more convenient than using ink or anything like that, because then you have to mix the ink. Back then that stuff was expensive. But if you just have a board covered with beeswax, you can write your symbols, show to your teacher, erase, do again. And we have found quite a few of those. Of course, not the beeswax is long since gone, but sometimes the wooden board is preserved, and the scratching and from the pressure of that what's the word for it? You use them to push on things, and like your stylus, thank you, of the stylus, you would still see the impression from the children's exercises. So then they would start writing just, syllabical things like ba, wa, ga. Then they would start learning, start putting together words, and then they would start practicing sentences. So in that sense, the education system was very similar. Not much has changed to how they teach kids today to learn to read and write, or at least they did when I was a kid in school anyway. And then, so that's stage one. And stage two, you would have a situation where a teacher might read a passage from Homer's The Iliad, a short passage. And another interesting thing about people in ancient world, and this is not just ancient Greece, this is everywhere, people did not know and did not have such a concept as reading quietly inside your own head. If a person was reading a letter, even if they were sitting at home alone, they would always read it out loud. The concept, the capacity for reading something within yourself, within your own mind, is something that developed fairly late in human history. That's just an interesting fact. So almost always an act of reading was an act of speaking. And so the teacher would read a passage, and then he would ask the students to read that passage with him for reading comprehension. And then they would have a discussion about what does this passage mean? What did the author mean to say? Like they do in literature classes today. And then they would talk about the virtues of this particular, for example, if it's something from Herodotus, as you know, about the war with Persia, they would go over a passage and say, well, do you think this commander made the right decision? Do you think this commander made the wrong decision? Was this beneficial to our Greek ancestors? Was this harmful? Who do you, I mean, they would use these passages from different well-known, very popular works, and every teacher used his own body of texts that he preferred. But they would use that for multiple reasons, for reading, to set their voice, to set their reading comprehension, to introduce them to history, because we remember that the ancient Greeks' mythological time was also actual factual history. Morality and the idea of what is right, what is wrong, and what is good, what is bad, what are virtues and what are faults within the society. And then also, just general cleverness, tactics, strategy, interpretation. Just it was like they do today in literature classes. I mean, nothing has changed in that sense. Later on, towards probably about 500 to 400 BC, the singing and the music, because music was super important in Greek culture. Music was very central in Greek culture. So musical education, which included, of course, dancing, singing, and playing an instrument. Everybody had to play an instrument. Everybody had to dance. Everybody had to sing. This is a quote, of course, not from ancient Greeks, but from a book by Marion Zimmer Bradley, the Darkover series, but only man can laugh, only man can cry, only man can dance. Well, that very much applies to Greece. If you cannot dance, you're not quite a human being. And that's also true about a lot of ancient culture. But they had different kinds of music. And of course, they even had a way of writing down notes. The problem is today's researchers, they see those texts and they even suspect that those are notes. But oftentimes it was letters rather than some sort of special symbols, but they have no way of deciphering them. And so the best they can do is reconstruct how any instrument that they might have found in an archaeological excavation may have sounded like, and make some suppositions, or to go by the descriptions of different types of music from just different ancient Greek authors. So they had different types of music. They had very kind of warlike, threatening, very fast-paced music that was intended to arouse and to excite. They had much more calmer, just like we do today, right? Love type music, pastoral music, and then they had ecstatic music during the Dionysus processions. Oftentimes, it would be very kind of like a rave today, where people would go crazy and just drunken women would be tearing random strangers and animals apart with their bare hands. And oftentimes, actually, music was even prescribed by doctors for people with mental disabilities or mental problems, or even just for regular physiological illnesses, because music was considered to have, of course, not the ecstatic music, right, but the calming kind of music was considered to have a healing quality and help with the soul. And that's, again, common for a lot of ancient civilizations. So they would be focused on that stuff. They would be focused, on reading comprehension, and they would start discussing statecraft. And that's what you were talking about, Ryan. At this stage, towards the end of their second stretch of study, and that would take longer. They would stay in that second stage until they turned 18. So however long it took you to get through the first school, unless you were completely a dummy, then, if your parents decided to send you to the second stage, you stayed there until you were 18. But yeah, they would discuss, various political organizations. They would talk about examples of various great people of the past. So it was somewhere a mixture between really our junior high and high school. And then, as we mentioned last time, at 18, every single male who was born, because they did record when they're legitimately born children from their lawful citizen wives, children who were going to be registered as actually free citizens of that polis. When they were born, they would have to introduce the child periodically throughout the child's life, saying, this is my child, lawfully born of my lawfully wed wife. All my neighbors know this child. This child is now going to be a citizen of this polis. Please acknowledge this child as lawfully born. Once the child was acknowledged, there was a roster made of who was born what year. And so they knew when the child would turn 18, and 18, all boys were drafted into boot camp. Like I mentioned last time, they would do 1 year of basically training. They would do training with special trainers who were provided by the government of the polis, with equipment that was provided by the government of the polis, using armor, using weapons that were provided, standardized by the government of the polis, and according to an exercise program that was approved by the government of the polis. So there would be special trainers. These people were much more respected than the original teachers. These were specially selected, very experienced, respected, usually warriors with some experience in past. So for a year they would be training, and then of course these boys were already in mint physical shape. They didn't have to do this whole hanging down, trying to do pull-ups thing that we see in movies today. But they would, their hand would be set right. They would be taught how to hold the shield right, and most importantly, to do what? How to fight in very famous and unique Greek formation, because that was an exercise in unity and an exercise in cohesion. And so learning how to work with the person in, phalanx that is lined up. How do you pronounce it in English again? Is it phalange? Phalanx. Is phalange, is that from the same word? Like fingers? I'm pretty sure does anybody know if like fingers, phalanges are from the same word as
phalanges are basically, I forget where the word comes from. Fingers and toes, actually.
Right. But I'm pretty sure it's the same root word. It just means together, because that's the idea behind it. How to say it? Phalanx. Phalanga in Russian and Greek, phalanga, but phalanx. It was that was a formation, and we will go in more depth about this when we start talking about military and wars, but it was something that was very unique to Greece, because first of all, Greece did not have much territory to do any sort of horse warfare, and didn't have much horses. I don't know if I showed you a picture of a Greek horse last time we were going through this, and if not, I will attach it to this podcast when I post it. I thought that the researchers, scientists were joking until I went to Greece and saw Greek horses. These are very sad and pathetic animals, because this is kind of a little side spiel. For a long time in Greece, Greeks lost their art of riding horses, or like even using them really in chariots for anything but chariot racing. So they wanted a very light, fast, elegant kind of, very streamlined horse. For a long time, they were breeding their horses the way they would be lighter, faster, quicker, and just like more gracile, I guess. Well, and then a bunch of people came into Greece. By people, I mean enemies, who were riding actual horses and doing battle on those horses. And so the Greeks went, oh, wait, crap, our horses, they're too small and too delicate. So they started breeding their horses towards heaviness. So what you have now in Greece is a horse that looks kind of like a barrel with little scrawny spider legs, which is neither fast nor graceful, nor very good for warfare. Bottom line is Greeks ruined their horses. Greeks never knew what to do much with their horses. They had horrible bridles with spikes in them, for example, that would tear at the horse's mouth. Greeks they lost their horsemanship skills fairly early on. And so instead of that, and plus where you're going to do a lot of horsemanship in Greece, where it's like this, everywhere rocky and stuff. And you have these little territories, right? We've talked last time how many polis. There was like 1,000 and some odd different polises on the territory of the Peloponnesus. So instead you have, and this is where democracy, it's a question, did the military formation build democracy, or did democracy create the military formation? Did the phalanx facilitate democracy? Why? So it's the chicken and the egg question. Because without democracy, there could have not been any sort of phalanx, and vice versa. Because in the phalanx, you have people who all very, sub-average fighters. I mean, these are not your heroic barbarian warriors who go woo and alone slaughter 500 enemies. And so what the Greeks invented, what they relied on. First of all, forget the horses. We're going to do it on foot. We don't have large territories to cover. We don't need a cavalry. We don't need any sort of chariots. We can march to our neighbor's borderline, which is like, I don't know, 50 meters out, and meet them in bloody mortal combat right there. Second of all, we're going to march in unison, right? And that's where phalanx comes from. But every soldier is subpar. Every soldier is equipped identically, and every soldier is doing the identical motion. The idea in that kind of formation is to not do anything special, to not be a hero, to not take a step forward, to not take a step back, because you take a step forward, you expose people on your sides. You take a step back, because every soldier, you guys all know, every soldier's shield, kind of like a fish scales, covers up the soldier next to them, or the fighter next to them. And so, I mean, all you have to do is really hold each other, poke, 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 and push. I mean, that's the whole. And that concept, I mean, stays with the idea of kind of infantry type, what we call infantry warfare, for a long time, until much past Rome, like towards very late Rome. But that was something. But here's the thing about phalanx. When you are I don't know, you're a smith, you're a bureaucrat, you are a teacher, and time comes for you to go to war to defend your country and your peoples. You know that this smith, that, you know, I don't know, barber over there, that doctor over there, they are all able-bodied men, and they all are going to pick up identical swords and identical spears, and they're all going to be standing shoulder to shoulder with you. And if any one of you wavers, the rest of you are dead. And so it really worked for cohesion of the society as a whole. It really brought the society together. And that's when the practice of, when the kids were little, before they were 7, to be allowed to be playing with everybody really came in handy, because those, you know, one of those kids may, and sometimes even people who were not citizens of that specific polis, but they were residing there. And sometimes even slaves, because the relationship with slaves in early Greece was very complicated. It was not uncommon, for example, to marry your daughter to your one house slave, because, you know, you've known this house slave forever. He's a good man. He eats at the same dinner table as you. Like, it's a family of, I don't know, two people, like one grandmother and 3 kids, right? And you have one slave. You work on the field together. You eat dinner together. You watch TV together, basically. So why not marry your daughter to that lovely slave that you've known since she was a big, right? So slaves were kind of a very relative early Greece, in early Greece concept. And sometimes even slaves would be in those ranks, because you didn't have, this is past the time of aristocratic warriors. This is past the time when a warrior in an expensive attire has to be paid for by the whole village gathering up money. This is a time when every citizen does his little bit, and together they're a huge force. And that was something that really united the people, because that sense of the shoulder, that sense of the crowd, right? That sense of unity. We are in it together. I'm not alone. My brothers, and even though I might be, I don't know, elected, I don't know, city state official, and he may be just a poor lowly teacher of the first grade, first stage category. The moment that danger comes, guess what? We're all equal. We're all men. We're all citizens. We stand shoulder to shoulder. And we used to play as little kids together. And that kind of reinforced that sense of equality, which I think sometimes is slipping from us in our modern life, because there's not that unifying factor to bring the people together. I'm going to stop. And I'm going to stop and see if anybody has something to say. David has a counterpoint.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just saying that it's amazing that this system that was developed then was used right up until about the Boer War. Like, everybody would stand together as basically one team against another team, and there was safety in numbers. Like, people would be dying next to you, but if you ran, you'd die for sure. So you were safer all together as one group, and that didn't change until almost World War I.
Middle of World War I, I'd say.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
What was your counterpoint?
My counterpoint is there were differences of wealth there. While your first-rate citizens would be your hoplites, more likely your unlanded slaves. Yeah, they wouldn't be citizens, right? But they might be slingers, they might be skirmishers, and those kind of roles. So yes, the slave might fight, but he'd be more likely to have no armor and some light javelins to sling at somebody. So go ahead.
I understand David's counterpoint, because he's the revolutionary and he's all the way for the downtrodden masses.
Absolutely.
All the way. Woo-hoo. You know, David is absolutely correct, but here's the thing. There was no such thing as second-class citizens in these city-states. There was only citizens and everybody else. You were either a citizen or you were nobody. Now, as a nobody doesn't mean that you were necessarily a slave. You could be a free man, but you had no rights. And of course, you would not be a part of that brotherhood because it's not your homeland that you're defending. So in that sense, David is both right and wrong in the sense that, yes, those people would be not armored, but the state would need to provide for them. Why would the state provide for some people who just nobodies, right? They would provide for them. Because to be a citizen in Greek city-states, you had to be of certain age, married, and have land, period, end of story. Ryan, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask about the importance of music in Greek society. Like it almost kind of rings a bell back to our earlier podcasts about
right. I remember that
the role of rhythm and whatnot in shamanism and whatnot. I wonder, so it was really seen as a healing like type of practice, even.
It was seen as almost psychedelic. How do I put it? Not even psychedelic. It was seen as music was seen as a very powerful instrument. So, for example, when we read Greek tragedies or comedies today, we are reading them off the piece of paper, right? All these performances would be with people singing, people clapping, people playing instruments, people dancing. These would be very colorful, very rhythmic. And while in warfare, for example, such thing as music was not used in the sense that they did not play like horns or, they didn't play, like they did in later military campaigns. But there was the stomping of feet, there was the clapping of shields, there was the banging of your spears and so on and so forth. So yes, of course, because this phalanx, when people are in line, they would have to move in unison, so it would be thump, thump, step, boom, boom, step. That's kind of how it would work. So in that sense, rhythm, and that's almost shamanistic in nature because it would elevate people, uplift people, put them almost in a trance. You know how it is when you're at a rock concert, right? When everybody's going to the music, everybody's, banging their head to the music, same sort of concept would apply.
That's kind of what I wondered. I figured that it might even go into the military aspects of the culture, to have this, rhythmic, everybody goes together and they're all in the same groove type thing. But I don't know.
And you would have to have that, to do anything kind of in a alignment, to do anything. I mean, chants, oftentimes be war cries, just people go, whoo, whoo. Oh, give me a second. I forgot what the Greek war cry. It was, ooh la 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 la, if I remember right. No, I'm serious. That was their horrible, dangerous war. I mean, that works for them. So for 1 year, every boy, young man would serve in the military in the training capacity. And 1 year they would serve actively defending the border, sometimes going out with aggressive wars. So it would be 1 year of preparation, 1 year of active military service. Of course, if there was a serious war, if there was a huge campaign going on, if there was an enemy at the gates, so to speak, then of course, other experienced veterans and so on would kick in and help with the youth. But the youth were the first, the kids of that year, who turned 19. So 18, you get drafted, 19 to 20, you serve. And the kids who were that age, they were the first line of defense. They were basically the people who were counted on, just like today in those countries where they have a military draft, right? Well, after you got done with the service, and this was a very honorary, very respected, very much, nobody tried to get a doctor's note that they have a crooked foot or broken tooth or something like that. People wanted to serve. To not be able to serve was, you might as well lie down and die, you're worthless, right? But once you're done with your service, that's when you can go into the third stage of education. You can actually, and that would be highly paid. And sometimes that's something that was not limited in time. Like if you wanted to truly pursue philosophy or some form of science, of course, Greeks didn't have science, but, usually it was a form of philosophy. You would go and find yourself a mentor, a teacher. And that's where famous people like, Socrates, and all the other great Greek. And they were, the ones we know is just a handful. There was somebody might have wanted to go and learn how to become an absolutely excellent musician. That was common. Or an outstanding boxer. They would go and seek themselves, sometimes a person who wasn't even offering lessons. Like, for example, they heard that there's a legendary archer, living in the city halfway across the peninsula. So they would go to this person and sit outside his gate and harass him until he would or would not agree to teach this person. Can you just say it? I missed it and I don't want to stop and read it.
Sure. Basically, just to kind of round back, phalanx and phalanges are the same, come from the same root word, meaning log.
Yeah, together.
And one of the things I found interesting about Greek education was their math, because it was all geometry based.
Right.
So instead of, as we learn now, essentially 3 plus 3, we might take 3 apples and then add another 3 apples and count the total number of apples. Well, what they would do is draw a line of 3 segments, and then from the end of that line, draw another one of 3 segments, and then measure the total length to do addition. So it was pretty interesting.
Because that's what happens when you don't have numbers, right?
Right.
I'm sorry, guys. Could somebody remind me what the heck I was just saying a second ago? But no, thanks, Mac.
I got distracted. I had another question actually, but anything I can do to jog your memory?
You were in the higher learning.
Oh, so higher education was something like, it was a lot like the studioses in medieval Europe, where you would go seek some great guru, basically, or great instructor, and you would
an apprenticeship.
Stop.
An apprenticeship.
Not quite. No, it wasn't really an apprenticeship. Apprenticeship, like if you were like a craftsman, you would seek apprenticeship. That was, and it wasn't, the thing is they didn't even have such a concept as apprenticeship, because you usually learned from your relatives, either your uncle or your father. They usually didn't take on, I'm almost done with this segment. They usually did not take on strange kids unless those kids happened to be somebody they adopted for whatever reason. The family trade secrets tended to stay. No, it was more like, it was a lot like, the perpetual student concept in modern. Go right ahead, Chris.
Yeah, there was a thing called an itinerant teacher back then. A teacher would be moving around and gather students around who would pay for the lessons at the end of the day. And really good teachers would get lots of students, and bad teachers, not so many. And that's the way, like you think in the Bible, the way Jesus went around preaching, it's exactly what an itinerant teacher did.
Thank you. Right. Exactly. And like you said, some would be absolutely, and some people spend the rest of their life doing nothing but that. Literally, they didn't do anything else. They just followed around a teacher until the teacher passed away, pretty much, and learned. David wants to jump in. I'm going to try to silence everything. So guys, if anybody speaks right now for a minute, we're not going to hear you.
Thank you. What I wanted to talk to you, to speak here about, was the big three of Greek philosophy, which was Socrates method, which is kind of the foundations of our scientific method today. Then Plato, theory of forms, and all that, and then Aristotle. And like Julie said, there were many other philosophers besides that. Part of the reason those three got transmitted because Aristotle was Alexander the Great's student. So, but they were important in those foundations of rational inquiry. Like the Socrates method was about being able to defend your position, as far as with facts, rather than with religious ideas or whatever. So I think that's a very important part that came out. Right. I think Socrates was born just after the Battle of Marathon, which had been about 470, I guess. And Aristotle died in 322 or something like that, BC. So over those 100 years, little more than 100 years, that and they were all from Athens too. So, but that's pretty much all I had. Okay.
I got a kick out of that, David. I have to admit, that was pretty good. In fact, I always loved the bit from that old movie that I grew up with. The only knowledge is in knowing that you know nothing. That's
right.
Socratic, yes. Right there.
Yes, exactly.
It kind of got in near that.
Awesomeness. I have no idea what I was saying, but bottom line is Greek music was very different than ours. Greek education was not that different than ours. And the Greeks typically did not, you could not get married if you were a male, you typically until you were 18. Ideally, you should be around 30. You should have already finished your service in the military. Then you should have pursued your higher education. You should have done some time, on the city council and other assistant, but not key roles in the governing of the polis. And only after you've done all of those stages and you have your own household, you have your own plot of land, are you considered to be a man in your prime, and you're fit to take a 14-year-old wife, right? Marriages in Greece were not made for love. I've discussed it last time. Greeks believed that primary function of marriage, and as in most societies, was to produce legitimate offspring and more better citizens for the polis. The idea was to marry a girl from a good family, and a good family meant modest, virgin, underage, by our standards, and citizen, and most importantly, citizen. It was generally believed that an attractive wife was nothing but a problem. You did not want an attractive wife. You did not want a smart wife. You wanted a homely wife who would be a good manager. And the whole purpose of marriage was not about romance or love. Greeks in generally, it's debatable, but some would go as far as to say that in Greek society, homosexual relationships, both for males and females, were considered to be more pure, better, and more civilized than heterosexual ones, because heterosexual relationships inherently included in them reproduction, which the Greeks oftentimes considered to be a very base animal thing. And so, love of a man to a man, like physical desire, and they believed that a man and a man, or a woman and a woman for that matter, because lesbian relationships were not necessarily frowned upon either. They were not considered infidelity in Greece, but men would copulate with their wives for the purpose of pure biological reproduction, but they would make love to their male lovers. In some cases, in some societies, that was almost the philosophy. And we are out of time. If anybody has any comments, and if anybody has extra time, I can tell you interesting stuff about Greek penises. I'm serious.
Are we going to do another episode on Greece? Because I figure we're going to have at least one more, probably two, but I guess.
I'm thinking one more on Greece, then take a break, do Africa, just to diversify, and then go back to Greece for a while, and then go back to Persia, and so on.
I only have to make one comment on the sexual relationship dynamics. That really reminds me of a little bit that I learned about Japan. That it was more honorable to have a homosexual relationship than a heterosexual one.
For sure. Okay.
Just very quickly, just a comment, and I can put it in the comment section. Is it's what you spoke of, kind of the standardization of education,
Mm-hmm.
and what we spoke about in previous episodes is the difference between oral and written histories, and the difference that plays in standardizing education. And so maybe in a future, we can maybe come back and talk about that.
That's a very valid point, and we will discuss that for sure. Okay, penises. So Greeks, if you look at Greek statues, you will notice two things. One, you will notice this relatively small by modern, adult industry standards, size of a male penis on statues and so forth. That's not because the Greeks were modest, that they were trying to make those parts not as prominent on their male heroes, gods, and so forth. It's because in Greek and later in Roman world, to have a large penis was considered to be unattractive, barbarous, animal-like, base, and very unmanly. They liked average-sized penises. Another interesting, and this was a genetic trait of the Greek people, males in particular, Greek people had very long foreskin. It's a condition, I don't remember the name of it right now, but today if a child is born with that condition, they actually perform a surgery because it is so narrow and tight that the edge of the foreskin actually hangs over the head of the penis and does not fully retract in an erect state. And very narrow, so it's very restrictive, but it was fairly common, normal among ancient Greek population. As we all know, Greeks exercised in the nude. So of course, people who have not looked into it are wondering, well, you're running around boxing with another guy and all your stuff is flapping every which direction, smacking him wherever. What the Greeks did, it's a very similar thing to what the Inuits have. like for example, Inuit in the winter, it's really hot with inside of their dwellings because it's designed to preserve heat. So if somebody is visiting another couple, for example, they will strip. It's normal to be completely naked within that space. But by the same token, you want to be decent. So if a man walks in certain tribes, not all of them, it used to be, if a man walks into another couple's dwelling, if he's completely naked, what he's going to do is he's going to take a little red string and like tie it around his penis. And that just symbolizes that he has no sexual intention. It's the same as getting dressed for us, basically. It's being decent. Well, the Greeks had a different way of doing that. They would have a special little string that they would tie around the edge of their foreskin over the tip of their penis. And then they would use that string to roll their penis up into a snail shape up against their body and tie it up that way. So when they did their running, their boxing, their throwing and everything else, that signalized that, look, I have no sexual intentions at this time. This is not an erotic encounter. It was an equivalent of wearing pants, basically. And it was also very convenient for all the nude sports that the Greeks typically performed. So I just thought you guys would find that little bit of a detail somewhat interesting anyway.
You are full of the best random facts, Julie, I swear.
I am to please, what can I say?
Is there any history that they carry that into warfare, literally?
I'm sure they did, because I mean, it's no different than a jockstrap, really. I mean, in a way, it serves the same sort of function. I would assume that anytime you're running around in a skirt, you've got to figure out a way to secure your bits, especially if you're going through thorny terrain and people are waving sharp objects around. No, because they're usually wearing the cover. I mean, you don't. I mean, you see it when they shown to do sports.
Wrestling.
You just don't see it. I mean, yeah, I think, but that specific snail shape, I think was very much related to sports. Yeah, but that's the interesting bit about the Greek bit.
It just reminded me of the old saying, you ever tried to run with this thing?
I always ask nudists that question, and some of them unfortunately answer.
Well, I'm actually quite the nudist, and because you brought it up, trust me, you don't want to run with that.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's still a certain reverence for penises in Greece.
Oh yeah. Of course, phallic symbols in Greece and ancient Rome. There was nothing vulgar about them. There was nothing per se even sexual about them. I mean, last time I was in Greece, I mean, like a couple of years ago, I mean, every little gas station shop in the middle of the road between Athens and Mycenae, you have your lighters, your Coca-Cola, whatever, your little souvenirs, and then you have wooden penis, like wine bottle openers. I have a couple that like sizes from this size to that size. I mean, totally realistic kind of dildos. I mean, but
in ancient Greece, wasn't the big symbol of like male prowess actually the muscles and whatnot?
No, the muscles were a symbol of male wholesomeness. In other words, it wasn't even the muscles; it was a certain well-built figure. The idea, Greeks were very fascinated with the idea of perfection, of being at your prime, being pretty, for the lack of a better term, though that's not entirely the correct term, but being visually appealing and standard and very, basically like beauty pageant almost. Apollo-like, for lack of a better term.
Okay, so it was like about the perfection of an athletic and strong, human figure. It wasn't really about even being strong. It was about being, perfectly chiseled almost. It
was about being in good shape. Now, the penis, the phallus symbol, somebody's going to have to help me translate the term. I'm going to say the term, and somebody who knows, Mac, you probably know the lore. It's the horn of plenty. Somebody help me out what I'm talking about here. Does anybody know what I'm talking about when I say horn of plenty? It's the picture of like a wool horn.
Cornucopia.
Yeah.
That's exactly what a phallus is in ancient Greek and Roman culture. That's exactly what it represents. It has nothing to do with sexuality. It is the source of endless seed. It's a source of harvest. It's a source of plenty. So it was not a sexual symbol at all. I mean, it would be like, in front of the house. Kind of like today people put, the clover, whatever, in front of their house, same sort of thing. It was just a good luck. Like, may this house have good fortune, money, food, love, peace, whatever. So it was separated from the sexual function completely. I mean, in that function it was.
Yeah, it was a fertility right.
To where, like in Roman times, somewhere I have a picture where they would have like penis phallus phallus amulet with little wings, because it's supposed to be like floating, but the phallus would have several phalluses.
Right.
So you would have a phallus that's like a creature with like multiple phalluses, because more phalluses is more fortune in your house, more plentiful. It's kind of interesting stuff. Wait, Ryan, where's the meow? You were supposed to bring a meow on the podcast. Where's the meow?
Yeah.
Oh, do you want to?
Yes, the kitty.
Oh, hold on 1 second.
Yeah, we need to say hello to this kitty.
Yes,
It's an important member of the crew,
it is.
and she's not very well right now, so we should all probably wish her well. I think she's not in any state to not be crew.
I'm gonna make you famous, little
How's
puglam.
she feeling?
Yeah.
Say hello to everybody. Wave with your foot. Wave with your paw. She's
Hello.
humming better, but we're struggling.
Hello.
Yeah. Oh, she's sleepy.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Ryan. I just wanted to, you said you would bring her on, so.
Well,
What's Ryan? What's her name? What's the story?
I'm sorry. What now?
What's her name? What's the story here?
We named her Neko-chan because I'm not very creative with names, and my sister insisted that she must have a name, so Little Kitty, why not? In Japanese. Yeah, she survived the cancer surgery well. She became a kitten again, but now she is sleepy, and I think she had a stroke. But
I know how to say meow in Japanese.
Lao?
Meow, it's with an N. Meow,
Meow, I thought, no, so it's not a meow.
meow. And dogs
she's
are
doing pretty good,
Wong
though.
wong.
But we're trying to just give her as much support as possible, and I bet that she is hungry.
She's always hungry. What are you talking about?
What's that?
She's always hungry.
Yep, it's her MO.
And guys, before I let you go, I'm going to just stand up real quick because gosh darn it, I spent like,
Oh, yeah, by the way, great outfit, Julie. I'm not really sure, what is the, what's the angle on this outfit? That doesn't really look
but
like
you guys see what I'm wearing here. Like, I'm not wearing period appropriate sandals because it's like 90 degrees. If I fall off this chair, I'm off. But this is basically a short version. Oops, my clothing is falling off. But it's a short version of a.
You might get your ratings on her.
I'm trying not to fall around, fall off. I mean, yeah. So I kind of cheated and stitched it together. It's here and there, but it's kind of what would be like what a juvenile female would wear, or Athena would wear because she usually was dressed, or like Amazon would wear because it's kind of a short. You know what I'm saying? And this is the summer version of the attire. I mean, I'm stuck on this chair. Hope. Wait. I think I got it. Thank you. But anyway,
that almost looks like a 50s dress.
Oh, I think the 50s dress was what stole it. So I did a little bit of embroidery around the edging. So what they would do is they would take 2 sheets of just square sheets of fabric, fold them over put edging around them, fold them over in the front, fold them over in the back, and they would use 2 clips. Like I stitched it together because I was afraid it was going to fall apart, and then they would tie it with a belt smack right under their breast. And usually fold a different time. And so this is a summer version, but if I wanted this to be a winter version, I would just unfold this and clip it a couple more times on my arms and then tie it anyway, and it creates a sleeve that way. I mean, that was the simplest way to make fabric clothing. But they would fold it this way and that way, different time periods, they would have different styles. And then if it was cold and they wanted like something like a hood, like in the rain, they would just have a square piece of wool that they would wear over their head. That was kind of biggish that you could wrap in. Like a blanket, basically like a small blanket. So, and that's what men and women both wore. I mean, men's would be folded differently, but you can see where, I'm saying there's not much of anything but a belt holding that together. So, I mean, that's why oftentimes in statues you have an Amazon whose, stuff is hanging out, and yeah. So modesty on the one hand was highly, among married women was highly treasured, but among like younger people, I mean, nudity was kind of not a big deal. So. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. I'm glad I was finally able to wear this outfit because I've been struggling. This thing is like just to tie it without a sleeve. I wouldn't have any idea how to do it. And by slave, I don't mean any modern problems. I'm talking about ancient Greek, domestic servants, sort of situation, just to make things very clear. Because unfortunately, that institution got worse as humanity progressed. And I just want to say, Nathan, thank you for many hours. You helped me put this thing together. I mean, this is quite a work of art. I mean, we were doing this for like a different picture set, but I mean, Nathan knows, he was there when we were putting this together. It was, I think, what was it, 4 hours of work? I bought a bunch of like fake snakes and then a wig, and anyway, that was an interesting.
It was a bit more than that.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of technique involved.
Oh yeah.
That's not simple.
Yeah, it's not easy. I mean,
the way that it presents online on screen, it looks effortless. It's not.
It was a nightmare. Yeah, it was like 4 or 5 hours worth of this stuff. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much, and we will see you all on the first. Those of you who can make it, it was awesome to have you here. All right.
Yeah, this
thing,
was fun. Everybody be well.
Bye bye.
As our legends unfold, we are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.